Welcome to the Meditation Ward. My name is Nadia Ward. I'm really excited to bring you this podcast where I talk to interesting people who also happen to be meditators. We talk about their stories, the way they got into meditation, and any tips or tools they'd like to share with you. Each week there's a second episode, a guided meditation that we hope you'll enjoy. If you would like to start your own meditation practice, we would love you to check out our course, Exploring Meditation, a 7-week course designed by me, Nadia. Each week you learn new tips and tools and how to create your own personal meditation practice that works for you. Follow us at The Meditation Ward on Instagram or go to the website themeditationward.com. Sign up for our emails and check out our courses. And now, on to the episode. Thank you for coming to the Meditation Ward. I'm really honored to get to have Rudy Gonsior here today. Rudy is a 20-plus year special operations veteran currently serving in the U.S. Army. His background includes multiple combat developments around the world, as well as tours of duty as a Special Forces sniper instructor and training and development officer for Special Forces candidates, among many other things. After years of struggling with PTSD, anxiety, depression, suicide, he has developed a deep passion for exploring and integrating the mental and physical mechanics of the human experience. Wow.
A lot.
That's a lot. Did I butcher your last name?
I've heard it before that way. So
yeah. How do you say it?
A great discussion of this. I don't actually really know. So it's complicated because like my name. So it's a Polish name. A lot of people start with it thinking it's like French or something, but there used to be a ski attached to the end of that. So it used to be Gonsior ski. So that's kind of how I go with it, because I feel like that's how it sounds. But at some point it got chopped off, and I've heard every variation between, middle school and frickin' being in the military. Like everybody has a different twist on it, and it's kind of funny. And me and Danica were talking about this the other day. It's like, how do you say your last name? And I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, Danica is his girlfriend, love of his life. So how do you say it? Like if you introduce yourself, or you just don't?
I usually just say Gonsior. I think that's
Gonsior.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I also hear other family members of mine pronounce it differently, so I'm like, am I wrong?
No. That's funny.
I don't know.
More importantly, your bio, it was incredible, and all the things that you've done. And, this being the meditation ward, we talk about kind of like not just your meditation practice, but your journey into your practice. So that might take a little while with all of the stuff that you've done. But I'm curious to even just start with how you're in Maine now, but like, where did you grow up and how did you end up getting into the Army / Special Forces?
Well, yeah, my whole life has been a roundabout journey. It was definitely not a straight path. But I now pretty much live where I grew up. So I grew up here in coastal Maine. Had pretty much an epic childhood. It was pretty awesome growing up here. Maine's a great place. Like, I just grew up on the islands, just running through the woods. It was pretty awesome. And I ended up I actually ended up in the Marines. I joined the Marines coming out of like high school. That kind of started this 20-year journey for me. At some point I switched over to the Army, and it was a really strong I guess tie. Like almost both my parents were in the military. Both my grandfathers were in the military. So it obviously had like a pretty big like effect on me. Like I grew up living next door to my grandfather, who was pretty much one of the most amazing people like I've ever known. Like just absolutely just full of like the craziest stories. Like so he dropped out of school in the 8th grade and ended up joining the Army right at the end of like World War II. Started this life adventure for him. And so like I spent a ton of time like with my grandparents. and just really just grew up with like all these just stories of like this adventure and like this curiosity, which like really kind of like vibe with me. And I think that's part of like what kind of led me to living a life of adventure. My story had a few more twists in it that I did not see coming, but yeah, that's kind of how I ended up there. It was a pretty natural, I think, progression like for me.
After you got into the Marines, you then became a special forces agent? How does
Yeah.
Are you making fun of me? I don't know.
It's
You
terminology.
became a 007?
Yeah, pretty much. No, so I ended up in the Marines. So I kind of joined like right after like 9/11, which was I guess it was like a really influential like time for me. You know, it's something that it's interesting. Like looking back at it now, like it's really kind of what I think pushed me like in that direction. It was a gateway kind of like into like this world. So I started out, I just pretty much just jumped like right in. I ended up in the infantry for about 4 years. So 4 years there with a combat tour, and even that was a pretty rough journey. I was in Iraq, so that '06, kind of at the beginning of what we now call like the surge and the Sunni insurgency. It was
Did you kill Bin Laden?
I did not kill Bin Laden. It was a really eye-opening experience like for me. I mean, as anybody, and I guess I would describe my experience coming into things like meditation. You know, a lot of people, I think, enter through a different doorway than the route that I kind of took. And I think kind of throws people off sometimes. You know, like a lot of people enter into, you know, meditation and mindfulness, kind of like from a place of like, I say, light. And, you know, I entered this through what I would call like a shadow gateway, looking into some very deep, dark places of the human experience, which is also completely wonderful and valid too. You know, a lot of people automatically kind of put this in a box, like these experiences. It's like, oh man, that must have been hard and dark. And it was, but it was also an incredible experience that I now treasure like more than like anything in my life. And that
Were
trip
you
was like,
living in a space of like daily fear and stuff when you were
oh,
there?
it's difficult to describe, but yeah, you know, I was very young at the time, 20 years old, and I can just remember like it was so not what I thought it was going to be. Every day was just a fight for life. Like uh, it was probably one of the most challenging times like I've ever gone through, like mentally, like and emotionally. I can just remember like every day just being like, God, like, please, like, just get me fucking through this, and I will never do anything interesting again in my life. Like,
Which was a complete lie.
it was just a complete lie. It was bargaining. It's part of like
Yeah.
this process of like grief, you know.
Yeah.
It was, you know, the ending. It's an opening, an ending of one thing, and an opening into another. But I went dragging and screaming, and it really brought me in close contact with some incredibly like dark parts, so like of like myself, and it took years like to really even like open up to that, because I mean it's what I kind of refer to as like a looking glass moment, where you're looking into like this mirror and you're seeing, you know, this dark mirror, and you're seeing who you really are. And that's a lot for like people, you know, to really look at yourself and to look at where you are like in humanity and like everything.
Mm.
And
What did you find?
well, I realized I was kind of a dick. Just it got me. It started this contact with this part of myself, that very like kind of primal. And in some ways, this journey arc basically goes through my entire life. But this is, I guess, the first time that I was really forced like face to face with this part of myself. And honestly, like I didn't really want to be face to face with that, but like the situations that occurred, like it was happening, whether you like it or not. Like, and it took, I mean, better part of like a decade really to kind of come full circle into that. But really, like you realize who you are, like in a lot of ways, and like both the good and the bad. And you start realizing, like, okay, this is the real you. And you have two choices, like in the looking glass moment. And one choice, which I think, a lot of us tend to make in our daily lives, if you have the ability to kind of lock that up and to kind of like hide yourself, like in the proverbial palace, and never like really face that. I think a lot of us choose that path, the path of least resistance. And I know, like I did, honestly, like even after coming into close contact with the real Rudy, like it was so much to take in. And then like I kind of like closed myself off. I knew it existed, but we just kind of like all pretending that part of me didn't exist, and you don't talk about it. Because honestly, it's really hard to even like put words to this dark part of like the human that a lot of people like it's taboo to like even talk about. Like earlier, we were kind of discussing, the vulnerability of like even discussing, topics like, suicide and things like that. That's part of like this dark shadow that's in there. And true, there's like that saying that like your greatest weaknesses are also like your greatest strengths. And that's something I've found, like this part of myself that I found ended up being pretty much like one of my favorite parts of myself. And it took years to like really embrace it. Like for me, like this, it's always been there. It's always been like a part. And I do often describe it. I describe it as like the beast. And it's this primal, like energetic, animalistic, like essence. And I think it's actually inside all of us to like various degrees. And for me, like I honestly can remember encountering this part of myself at a very, very young age, probably about 4 or 5 years old. I can remember.
And are you talking too about the shadow gateway as well as the beast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess the beast is like the
part of your shadow,
the vehicle. Yeah, my shadow, and like kind of coming through like this gateway into mindfulness, meditation, and awareness, and that's really what brought me through it. And like the darkness, like it was something that I was saying, like probably 4 or 5 years old was like when I first like started to encounter this part of myself. I can remember sitting like in church, like with my grandmother, and I remember like listening to, I think it was the story of like Cain and Abel, and like the concept of like murder, of like Cain murdering like Abel, and the first time like that thought and like idea of like one human being like killing like another, and like 4 or 5 years old, like that's some pretty dark shit to be contemplating and being like, yeah, I get that. And but I also like there's a part of me at that time that I was just like, all right, don't ever tell anybody about this, like this part of you, this awareness.
Right, the part of you that didn't like push it away, but kind of like thought more about it and what it would be like.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be pretty shameful as a 4-year-old, or
it's
like in your head.
Yeah, incredibly difficult just to know that like there's this part of you that's inside of you, not really understand like why this mechanism for yourself exists. And like again, my time that first experiences in combat like brought me in close contact. Like it strips you like really raw, and you, like I was saying, you get to kind of see like these parts of yourself, and you're like, oh my fucking god, like it's scary, like to really see that. And again, like to struggle with that and then not be able to say anything, because one, there's a part of you that feels very isolated, like how do you talk about that? Like, there's not a lot of open conversation about like these sort of things, and most of us, like in the, say, like the Western world, we have this ability to insulate like the things that are from things that make us feel uncomfortable. And we tend to do that. Even me, like when I come back from this first experience, I'm just like, all right, we'll put this in the box and we'll never talk about this again. And that was like this dark like gateway, because it definitely opened something, but it was something that it took a long time to like to really kind of come about, in that first experience. But it was also something that just kept drawing me back. And I think it's probably a little bit unusual for most people to kind of enter into this world that way. But I think honestly, there's a lot more people that kind of do experience these things, and they're wonderful opportunities. Like the shadow is such a powerful like tool, and that's kind of how I ended up in this space. That
Using that fierce side of you, that like unfearful side of you, that's like a fighter and dark, to let you go to these spaces of.
Yeah, like I guess in many ways, this beast kind of like dragged the rest of me along for the journey. And
Yeah.
because I think very much like the human mind is, we often think of it as like this monolithic thing, right? When you think of yourself, a lot of us tend to grow up with like this structure of being an individual. But the reality is, like, who we are inside of our heads is divisible. Like there's all sorts of different parts of us. And I feel like the beast part of myself, like in this experience, really grew like super strong, and it pulled me like into like this space in a very, very uncomfortable way. For me, this was after that first experience. I ended up going over to Marine Special Operations after that deployment. And then I ended up being recruited and selected into Army Special Forces like a year or two later. And so I've stayed like in that world. That's where I'm still at now. And
Are you considered a Green Beret?
yes. So,
and what does a Green Beret really mean? Because I've always found that like super interesting. I just know you do some wild stuff.
it means we wear a silly, useless hat.
You literally wear a Green Beret?
Not all the time.
Okay.
But yes,
That didn't even cross my mind.
short side note. So yeah, the world of like special operations, there's a lot of like nuanced facets. Basically, at the end of World War II, they had what was called like the Office of Strategic Services, and so they kind of broke that into two separate groups. At the end of the war, you ended up with the CIA that handled most of the intelligence stuff. They kind of started that, and then Special Forces got started to kind of handle the more technical aspects of operations, such as unconventional warfare, not so much the espionage, but like sabotage, things like that. Basically working behind enemy lines, and it's kind of morphed now into what we now call special operations, which is kind of like an umbrella term for a lot of different things. So things that are within special operations, like Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, things like that. Those are all considered special operations. But the Special Forces is basically a separate like force. Again, our missions primarily focused on unconventional warfare, but we do a lot of other stuff as well. Back in the 60s, basically they all wore like Green Berets. So it's kind of like from the early years. It's a market distinction, like a symbol.
Yeah. I have a question about your beast. A couple. Say you're like 20 to 25. What percentage, this is a two-part question, what percentage do you think was the beast running you versus your person, your truth, or who you were? And now, what would you say the percentage of beast versus you that comes through or indecision wise, or just like consciousness wise?
I would say like it ebbs and flows, like anything. And I think in these years of turmoil for me, it was like this tug of war. There was not the continuity between the different parts of myself. I was basically at war within myself, and that's what made it like really a struggle. And oftentimes, I think when we're discussing things like PTSD, for example, like I had from just this first experience, and many sequential experiences after this, like I struggled a lot with post-traumatic stress and a lot of like depression, anxiety, and it brought me to like this point of suicide. And I think a lot of what like post-traumatic stress is, I mean, it's experiencing an incredibly traumatic event, and then it's this differential that occurs within inside of yourself against these different parts. And for me, that's what I was experiencing. I mean, it was some absolutely insane experiences, and then not knowing like the different parts being like at odds with themselves and like trying to like figure this out. And I lived with that for, like I say, over a decade, and kind of continued going on. It would be like this tug of war. Like I would go, again, I would just continue to deploy, and like on deployment, like that's where come into like this really close contact, because like this beast part, like it would live and it would thrive like in those environments. And it was just like, holy shit, like this thing is like out of fucking control. Like this thing is inside of me, and I barely know how to like control it at some points. And so it would have these periods where it would just be kind of like running like loose, and then at other times like it would die down and be able to like live a normal life. And so I think like
it was kind of at its discretion.
Yeah, and discretion and also circumstance. I think circumstances sometimes very much shift like what is needed like in us. But for me, not knowing what was going on, like not really understanding the mechanisms at play, it was a freaking nightmare to like deal with, and it made things like really difficult because there wasn't any sort of harmony like within like myself. Like I said, it was always this tug of war, me trying to control this part of myself, and that I think was at like the core of like a lot of my distress. And it would get to this point where, in the later years, like it was so exhausting. Like I was contemplating, like I just want this to end. Like I don't think I didn't want to die, but like I didn't want to kill myself, but like I wanted it to just end. And like if like for me, I was like, all right, like if maybe this is an option, like I wouldn't be the first person to be here. And that is kind of what began to kind of push me into exploring like that actual experience. So 2012, I'd just come back from a super, we say kinetic in deployment. I did a 10-month deployment to Afghanistan, and it's probably one of the most violent experiences that I've had, but also like one of the most successful deployments that I've also had. And coming back from that, I was just so like burnt out from that experience, and I was about to like leave the Army, and I ended up being talked into taking a position as a sniper instructor. So that trip, I had spent pretty much the entire time operating as a special operations sniper. And so I had all this experience, and I got offered this position to teach. And the great thing about like teaching is you think you know shit until you have to like teach it to somebody else. And then you start.
Yeah, being a teacher really makes you an expert in a way, because if you can own it and properly teach.
It really, yeah.
Yeah.
For me, because you could be having a conversation about something, and you never know where the conversation is going to go. But like oftentimes, you have to know something, 3 or 4 levels deeper than the question that might be asked of you. And so it really started making me deep dive, like a lot of things. And so, I mean, I guess tying it back into like meditation, like I grew up shooting. Like I've been pretty much shooting since I was like about 12. So a lot of my deep diving as an instructor revolved around. It's kind of started with just a deeper understanding of the fundamentals of marksmanship. Which again, it sounds like a really weird way to get into meditation, but knowing what I know now, I'm like, like no wonder I ended up where I am. So within like the fundamentals of marksmanship, it's kind of broken down into 4 major sections. Like, so your first is like body position. So obviously, like to stabilize like a rifle, your body has to not be moving because your body is connected to the rifle. So if the rifle's moving, it's pretty hard to actually hit something. And then sight alignment, sight picture, that's just kind of orientating the rifle in the right direction. But the third is breath, which was like, it was a really big part of both marksmanship, but also this journey that I kind of began into meditation.
You're supposed to be at the top of your breath, right? When you shoot?
No,
Bottom?
the bottom. So there's
Interesting.
there's a mechanical aspect to breathing. Why it's important in marksmanship is one, like if you're at a different point in your breath, it actually shifts your skeletal structure. So like if you breathe in, it can shift your skeletal structure up or down. So that kind of shifts what we call the natural point of aim of the rifle. So we want to come to the same point every single time to maintain consistency. And
and your inhales could be different levels, but your complete exhale is always the same.
I'm trying to be a good shooter. So yeah. So if you get into different positions, how much you can actually breathe in or breathe out is going to be different. But the most consistent thing you can do is come to what we call like the natural respiratory pause. So you breathe in and you breathe out, and you kind of come to this relaxed state. You can actually depress your diaphragm a little bit further, and it will force a little bit more air out. But you just come to like this relaxed, like neutral state. And once you're there, like that's where you're going to break your shot. So it has a big like physiological effect. Like you want to be in the same place every single time. But then you can't stay there very long. So staying there, the problem that happens right about 6 to 8 seconds as you start kind of holding your breath. This is when like your brain starts to flip off anything that considers non-critical functions. So eventually, like if you've ever been like passed out or something, from a lack of oxygen, basically what will happen is like your tunnel vision, color starts to go, sound starts to go. That's basically your brain being like, oh shit, like we're dying. Like let's start turning off anything that's not important so we can focus on what is important. So in marksmanship, it's kind of weird because typically you don't hold your breath that long, but the brain actually starts doing this right around like 6 to 8 seconds. And the very first thing that starts to go is like your fine visual acuity. And so like kind of understanding more about this, I started to realize, I'm like, oh, what we're doing with our breath has a really big impact on like how we're thinking and processing. And I would see it oftentimes like we conduct, stress shoots for the students where we put them through like these series, like these, we call them like run and gun events where they're moving and they're shooting, sometimes like through like a urban like obstacle course. And I mean, it doesn't take long to start like really being under a lot of physical pressure where like your aerobic capacity is just being pushed to the max. And even then you start, guys get into some of these positions and they're trying to like shoot, and then as an instructor you're watching and it's like this dude hasn't taken a breath in like 30-40 seconds, and like he's struggling to like make this shot, and it's just like the brain is just like turning everything off, and the longer he holds it, the harder it gets, never gets any better. And so it got me interested. I was like, I want to know more about what's going on like with the breath. And it kind of like led me to exploring like a lot of these sort of things and realizing that to control mental states, your breath has like a really huge impact, especially like in the immediate. And it kind of brought me into contact with like some of the techniques that are very common in other parts of like other parts of culture, but not so much in ours. Things like box breathing. This was something that I ended up learning from some British special forces guys that taught me this. And honestly, the first time I heard it, I was like, man, that is some like kind of like woo shit. Like, but it works, and you're able to begin to mentally kind of take control of the situation. You're basically manipulating the body with like an intention to set yourself up to make kind of like the best decisions. The simplest solution is to basically breathe in and breathe out again. Like, so we teach a lot where, like you pop into, a position, usually like 3 deep breaths that kind of basically settle you. And like if you're breaking the shot, if the shot's not happening, you just breathe in again and reset. But yeah, that whole journey of like the breath kind of led into some other things where I started exploring, got really interesting spaces of like intuitive experiences. I also started competing at this time as a professional shooter in competitions. Won a couple international like titles during this period, and trying to bring that back and trying to explain.
No big deal, Rudy.
No big deal. But it basically created this pressure because people were like, okay, you're doing this, teach me. Like, and I was like, I don't know how. I don't know what's going on. I can't, like, how do I replicate this? Like, I'm only one person. I guess, like, as an instructor, like, that was kind of this realization from a professional standpoint. I was like, in a very practical sense, I can only shoot like so many bad guys.
Yeah.
Like this realization that I wanted to, I guess, bring this part, like it's a very practical aspect of like being put in this position, trying to explain to other people what this experience is. And so it led me into kind of this exploration of like intuitive behaviors and like self-cognitive processing. And mindful the whole time here, I'm still like struggling deeply with post-traumatic stress and suicide, idealization at this time of my life. So it's like there's like these two like things that are going on, and like I'm an emotional wreck inside, but I'm also having the stimulus from this professional stimulus that's like kind of creating like a lot of this. And eventually it kind of came to a head. I did get out of the military after 3 years of instructing for a short period of time. And it was probably like one of my lowest points like in my life, where it was just so much going on. I couldn't like really, there's some parts of it in the sense that they wanted me to go back to operational status. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I was just like, I feel like I'm not capable right now of doing that job. And so I ended up quitting essentially. And that brought me to like this dark place. And it was several years of just an incredible like struggle. And it ended up, a lot of things were just surfacing. It was just kind of like just sinking into this muck. And in this muck ran into just, again, more parts of myself. And also a lot of like physical problems started kind of like popping up in this space. Started struggling a lot, like cognitively. I have God knows how many concussive injuries from, fighting IEDs, things like that. And it was pretty much the worst time of my life. It showed in so many ways. It created a very dysfunctional like family state. It was a nightmare of like an experience, but it was like this slow, that kind of used the phrase of like the frog boiling in the pot. Like I was that frog, and it was just like just slowly getting worse and worse, and it eventually got to a point where it ended my marriage. Um, and it kind of brought me to this point. I remember, because I actually ended up joining the army again, and basically, um, my former wife ended up, just saying I can't deal with this, and so she ended up leaving, and I was kind of like in a state of denial for like a long time. I look back now and I can obviously see it coming, and it was just a very difficult.
Do you blame her? Would you have?
Oh no.
Yeah.
um,
I mean, like not for the divorce, but for like not being able to handle that, or
yeah, I mean it's such a complicated, like, I guess,
yeah,
set of circumstances where, we were both married, very young. You're married at age 20, and that's a whole nother ball of wax.
right.
Um, but I guess it was kind of like this again. It was like this looking glass moment where when she left, I realized I didn't have anybody else to blame. And it might sound kind of weird, but like oftentimes I think when we're in a tremendous amount of pain, it's very natural to kind of place that blame or responsibility onto others for either helping you or people, like are responsible for your state. And I think we see that a lot in the veteran community. I don't think it's really talked about a lot. Um, but you see this, essentially, you call it like a victim mentality where you kind of blame like
Yeah.
the,
It's also a survival mentality as well,
and I think
right?
it's a very natural part of
Yeah.
like experiencing like hard things that like are ruining you. Like, and so I think it's a stage of like that grief. And I think the tricky part is a lot of people sometimes get stuck like in that state. And I see it a lot of times like with other veterans, where they can spend years kind of like stuck in this state where their situation is somehow somebody else's, like their reason for being there is not theirs. And like I said, like it's a normal state and experience to like a stage to kind of go through. But I think a lot of us get stuck in that. And I guess for me, when she left, like that really just kind of shocked me out of it. Like there wasn't anybody else to pick up, my slack for being like a not great father. There wasn't anybody. And I can remember like I went out to Death Valley, literally like the weekend, like 2 days like after she left, and I was stuck out doing this training exercise in Death Valley. And I just realized, just sitting out in the desert, like, fuck, man, there's nobody else now. It's just you. So you need to you want to be different. You want to live like this? No, you don't. So like, it's on you now. If you want something, if you want to heal, it's up to you. Nobody else is coming. And
Yeah. It's like hitting like that was maybe close to your rock bottom of like having all these things, getting that depressed, leaving the military, getting divorced, and then realizing you're like alone, that was like a pivotal moment.
yeah, it was definitely a moment which a lot of things kind of turned on. Like for me,
Yeah.
like it was that moment of clarity that it was up to me now. And it kind of, I didn't even know like where to start. My life was such a freaking mess. And on the outside, it looked okay. But like on the inside, it was something that it was so dark. So I can remember like, so she left, it ended up going like Europe, like immediately after this. And like, so I was basically at home, like with my son and like getting ready to leave the next day. I remember I literally drank myself like into oblivion. And I woke up like the next morning, like in bed, like with a loaded like pistol, like in bed. And I was like, I don't even know how I got here. And I think I was just so like, I just wanted to die, even in the morning waking up. Like, I just wanted this like to end. And honestly, the only reason I don't think I did is because I had my son at the time. I was supposed to drop him off that morning and then hop on a flight to go out to Death Valley. And I was just like, man, like that would be like really fucked up to do that like while he's here. I don't want to do that. And so I got dressed and I took him over to like my parents. And by that time I was like, well, I got pants on, I might as well go to the airport.
Got pants on.
And it was kind of like that time out in the desert was just like, all right, it's just you. Like, it's time. And I didn't really know like where to like even like start in this journey. Like I said, like obviously I've been playing with, mindfulness and like some breathing stuff, but like those dots were not really connected for me. I was aware of like some mechanical aspects, but I ended up, long story short, I ended up doing. I ended up talking to a good friend and mentor of mine, a fellow Marine Corps scout sniper, Kalen, who's been somebody who's kind of just periodically always kind of been popping into my life for like the last decade. And I remember after my time out in the desert, I started talking with him, and I was just like, man, like this is my fucked up life. I don't even know where to begin. And he's like, dude, he's like, let me tell you about this experience that I had in Peru. And so he begins to tell me about this experience of basically this journey like with ayahuasca. And I didn't know anything like about psychedelics or anything at this point in my life. I grew up, very very well behaved, so to speak. I never even like smoked weed or anything like that growing up. And I was like, this was just a wild like world to me. And I'm like, that sounds like some hippy dippy shit. But I'm like, there's something more here to this, and like a lot of things that people are kind of talking about and experiencing from this space. Like I said earlier, I'd kind of describe our way into this as kind of the shadow gate. It's like this back door. And so I started hearing people talk about like their kind of journeys and their experiences. I was like, I know these things, like these things that people are talking about. I just found them a different way. And it was really helpful to have somebody like Kaylin, who comes from like the world that I come from, having kind of walked this path already. And so I ended up basically going into a journey with ayahuasca later, right about 6 months later.
Did you go to Peru?
So I ended up going to Costa Rica.
Okay.
So I actually worked with a nonprofit called Heroic Hearts Project, which is a really great like veteran nonprofit. So their whole function basically started by this guy Jesse Gould. So he's a former Army Ranger. And he started this nonprofit basically to take veterans who were kind of struggling like with post-traumatic stress and connect them with shamans and facilitators. And so I ended up going down to Costa Rica. I went with there was 2 Marines, Ranger, 2 Canadian Special Forces guys, 2 British SAS guys, and it was a incredibly transformational experience, like in so many ways. But I guess the big part of me is it put me into, again, this very, very close contact with that beast part of myself. And it ended up like really healing like this relationship with that part of myself. Because again, like I said earlier, like I think sometimes the most difficult parts of ourselves are actually like our best parts, just waiting to be like explored. And I can remember being in ceremony, like, and these experiences were just so freaking intense. And there was times when it was just like the only thing that you can do is breathe. And it was just like, I can take one more breath. I'm like, all right, I did that. I'm going to take one more breath. And it really, that experience, working, with like this plant medicine, it opens part of my understanding of how to connect like with the body. And I realized that's like kind of where I came to like this conclusion and this understanding that like a big part of like my struggle was like this disconnect between these different parts of my mind and even my body. And kind of coming out of that experience, I was like, all right, how do I integrate these experiences? Because it's really great to go and just trip balls in the jungle. But what really matters is like, all right, when you come back from this, how does this change your life? And in many ways, it's an opening, and it's giving you basically a bag of tools. Like, all right, you're ready. Go back out into the world and change your actual physical existence as well. And I guess being open like that and realizing, okay, I got some tools here to work with. That's how I ended up kind of starting to play with, meditation. And because I had tried, prior to this, I guess what led me to like this extreme example of, having to go to the jungle and do psychedelics. What led me to that was kind of failing like repeatedly, like doing like talk therapy. There was some good success that kind of came from that. And I tried like kind of doing meditation and stuff, and it was like this wall. Like I can remember just sitting, trying to like meditate, doing guided meditations and just being like, I fucking can't. It's so hard. And, and again, like I'd also like when I'd gotten out of the military, I'd gone to the VA, and like their solution was like, here, take all these different drugs. Like, we'll just throw a bunch of shit at the wall and see what sticks. And I was like, no. There's a part of me that like knew I was like, that's not going to work very well. And so it was kind of like an act of desperation, really. I was out of options, and this was like the last like Hail Mary for me to like really try to save myself. It opened something into me, and like it's really difficult to describe, but I guess the opening was like this awareness of the connection of like mind and body together. And one of the things that just really stuck with me was like this meditation, especially through manipulation of breath, and how powerful that can be. And it led into me exploring kind of like different like concepts and modalities of like meditation. A short time after that, like I started tantric practice. And a lot of people hear tantric and they automatically start thinking like, oh, like sex and like things like that. But for me, it was honestly just this understanding like energetic flow, both like in and out. And honestly, a big part of it was capturing like joy and bliss. Like, and there was so much that like came out of that, and this understanding for me of like kind of like what meditation actually is. Like for me, I can remember going back before this, like talking, with a therapist, and being like, have you ever thought about meditation? And I'm like, I don't even know what meditation is. Like, so I guess coming out of this experience, like it really made me start to explore that. And when I say like meditation, like for me, like what I'm kind of describing, I guess, is kind of creating like this conscious like thread or like tether like with your mind and body, and kind of just like connecting those two. And you can kind of use it for the different purposes of having flow come in or having flow come out. So like flow out, like I kind of see it as kind of like trying to focus like on something. Like if I really want to like focus on something, like this meditation, these different practices are kind of, it's an outflow. Or you can kind of reverse that energetic flow, and it's kind of like an inwards, where I'm contemplating, where I'm kind of focusing on a part that's like inside that I want to really kind of explore. And it's very like simple terms, and the term meditation I think is it's so huge and like nebulous. It means a lot of different things to different people. But when I think about it, like it's kind of like where I go with it, just like creating like the conscious tether, you know, between the different parts of like the mind and the body, and this kind of bringing everything together for like a little while and kind of help focusing for coming in or coming out. The breath was for me like a huge part of that. Like that was just, and it had just been staring me like in the face the whole time. To go back to like my experiences, like, you know, shooting for years, I was like, I've been doing this the whole freaking time. But like it never really made sense to me. It's just all around it. I had all these pieces. And then that journey made me kind of realize I'm like, all these pieces can kind of come together for this.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's like, yes, we all do breathe all day, but we don't pay any attention to it. And we literally wouldn't even be alive without this. Yet we give it no time, you know? So it's like, what would happen if you focused on 10 in one day? 10 of them, you know? Like, what a huge difference it makes.
Yeah, no, totally. Like, I guess it's, yeah, just looking back, like, it's funny, like, again, to kind of come in the back door to like breathing and like meditation. And it's from a direction that like a lot of people don't really connect this way through it. And so it was a lot of like, I guess, wandering around, like,
Yeah.
for lack of better terms, because I guess my community that I come from doesn't have a lot of people that traverse this. Like, it's surprisingly, I look around now and I see a lot of people that are just they're in this space, but they don't know it yet. And it's right there, because I think you're seeing, especially within, you know, special operations specifically, you know, most of us have now been doing this for the last 15 to 20 years, you know, with, you know, the circumstances that have existed in the world. And we have this combination of experiencing some very like tremendous and powerful experiences with our lives that we have lived, but we're also now becoming very open to like exploring that with a little bit more detail. And some of these tools that generations in the past of, you know, let's say warriors have not necessarily had. Although when we kind of look at the warrior experience, like, you know, if you go back, you know, millennia, you do see this very strong connection with, you know, the mindfulness and meditation, like in this space. But I think in our culture now, for many years, like that connection for warriors has been very, very difficult, because we don't really have a culture or community that supported it well. But I just think through the time and experience and basically the opportunities that we're being afforded now, you're starting to see kind of this weird, let's say, cult that's kind of appearing like within, especially the special operations community, of people that are exploring like a very wide spectrum, because they've seen some fascinating sides of the universe, and they're like, man, there's something going on here.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we look at things as like this line, this spectrum of like of experience. And I think if you zoom out far enough, you start to see that it's not really a line. It's actually just a segment of this huge circle that ends up coming back. And so, you know, martial arts is a good example of that. A lot of like the things that we do nowadays, like yoga, like Tai Chi, like a lot of these are actually connected to some very, very old like martial practices. And it's kind of weird now, because a lot of the martial practices that we have that are kind of modern, functional, are not connected to this spiritual, this physiological aspect. I think we're starting to see that connection, like I was kind of discussing earlier. I think you're seeing more recognition that it is like that wide circle, that the light is the darkness just as much as the darkness is the light. Really, there's no good or evil. It's all just the same thing. And it's a lot to kind of like take in, but I think the more time you spend like in that space, you start to realize like, oh, this is all the same thing. We're all kind of connected to it.
Have you heard of the Bhagavad Gita?
Oh, freaking love it.
Yeah. So it's like, like the idea of war is hard, and the work and the violence and the stuff you said about like killing bad guys and stuff. It's like, it's hard for those of us who haven't been there. We appreciate, but we couldn't do that, or, whatever it is. And the Bhagavad Gita is basically a story. Well, it's a song that Krishna sings to Arjuna on a battlefield, where Arjuna doesn't want to have to fight a war against his brother. And Krishna is like, there's evil in the world. You have to fight. Like, it's not about like nonviolence all the time and never doing anything like that. It's like, there is evil in this world. But there is a question that I wanted to ask you that I wrote down a while ago that kind of goes into this part with like all the violence that you've had to see and be in. Two questions. Do you ever like regret the path you took? In some ways, I know you're probably wouldn't be who you are now. You wouldn't have the love of your life now and all these things. But like, what would you change anything if you were to go back? And secondly, what kind of tools do you need to use or have learned to use, if any? Maybe you don't even have to separate yourself from the person who has to do these acts of violence, if that makes sense.
All right. A lot of questions.
Yeah.
There.
I hope that's okay.
Well, what was the first question?
The first question is, well, you probably don't regret like where you are now. Do you regret sometimes your path you took, or what would you kind of change, if anything?
Yeah. I would change nothing.
Okay.
I've had this realization, I guess, in the coming of like all these experiences, and trying to put them into greater understanding, because I think, again, a lot of the struggle is we have like these boxes that we kind of put our experiences in, and we're like, all right, this is the shape of the universe, and inevitably, it doesn't matter how good your box is, it's just eventually it's gonna get full, and it's gonna freaking rupture, because like it just doesn't work that way. And so like these ideas, when we become very attached to our boxes and our ideas, like that's where like a lot of pain and suffering comes from, is being attached to thinking that the world is a certain way. And like for me, like that's this experience, that's the necessity is to have a box, and to have it can be completely destroyed from time to time. And so when I look at the experiences that I've had, they have been incredibly painful. Like, it's been a lot of suffering. It's created, not just for me, like it's been hard, on my family, it's been hard on my kids, but also like it's in like this pain and this suffering, like that is where this is the experience. Like it's there. That's what it's for. The pain draws like this attention to existence and growth. And I look back like at a lot of my experiences, and I wish there's a part of me that is like, why does it have to be this way? And I think oftentimes that part of us that wants it to be different, wants it to be easy, like that's a part of us that like it's scared to be in a state of pain. And it's okay to have that. But I think I've come to this understanding that the purpose of like this life and this existence with all of us together is not to be perfect. It's not to fix. Oftentimes there's like this idea of like saving the world, that we have to fix like everything, that if everybody would just freaking get on board and freaking behave and do good things, that life would be like, it'd be like a heaven on earth.
Yeah.
But I think that is not the point of what we're experiencing here. I think the beauty of our existence is that it's meant to change us. We're not meant to like fix it. It's meant to be an experience that changes who we are. And that only comes through pain. Not only, I'll take that back. Pain is an incredibly powerful mechanism for change. And I think you are
and
bound
anger, anxiety,
to all of that. Like, so oftentimes we experience pain, especially here, like in the West, America, we have such an amazing ability to circumvent pain. Like, we can avoid it a lot, and we do. We getting pretty good at it. We have a whole culture that is, you know, like the American dream. Like, it's a big part of the American dream is basically escaping like a lot of the pain and suffering. There's the attempt to escape the pain, I guess, is where a lot of our problems, because we run and we can run and run. I ran for freaking years. It's weird because there's a part of me that kept pulling me like to this war and this suffering and this pain. And I was like, what the fuck? I can remember one time, like, I remember standing in the shower after this deployment for like an hour and just like in fucking tears because there's a part of me that wanted to go back so bad. Then there was this other part of me that was just like, we can't do this. Like, you are going to fucking kill us if you keep going back. And like, there's a part of me that wanted both those things. And I think when we come into understanding what the experience is, and like, again, this mindset of like, okay, this is happening for me, this pain and this suffering, this is a part of it. And it's not to say that you can't experience, you know, joy and love and trust. Like, those are like some of the most amazing, beautiful things that I experience now. Like, to know like this love and joy at a level I have never even could have imagined existed only happened because of my experiences of like embracing like the pain and like the suffering. And also, I think we have to realize that like we are all mechanisms for each other to experience, you know, that pain and suffering sometimes. When you're, you know, potentially in conflict or struggling against another person, you know, sometimes like that experience is necessary for you just as it is for them. And that was a really hard thing for me to, I guess, really think about and kind of like take in, you know, thinking about, you know, the conflicts that I've had in some of my experiences have involved some incredibly difficult experiences where, you know, I was in conflict with individuals that I knew like personally, and to like have to take a life of somebody that you know like at a personal level, that you've literally sat down and, you know, you've had meals with this person, you've talked about your kids with this person, and then end up on a battlefield coming, you know, face to face with that person and taking their life. That's a lot to like really process. I'm like, why is this happening? Like, how the fuck did we get here? Why? Just
That's
the
probably
why.
one of the hardest things.
Yeah, it was one of the hardest things to experience. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of different answers to it. And the answer I'm on at this point in my life is like, we both needed that experience together. And it's not that he was bad. It's not that I'm bad. And it's maybe he is bad and maybe I'm also bad, you know, to leave. I can remember seeing his sons, you know, a short time afterwards, you know, ages, you know, 6 and 12, and being like, oh my God, I've created like this absolute like nightmare of a situation, and being like, why? Again, why? Like, why did this experience have to happen this way? And I think, again, the point of the existence is not to change, but to be changed. There's a part of that wishes for like that heaven on earth, but like, this is Earth. this this is the point of the existence, is to experience something. And I think that's the most powerful thing that we can do, is to honor those experiences and recognize them, like, okay, like this is part of this human experience. And I think it's hard, because when you step into some of these spaces, they're very taboo like topics. Kind of to go back to like even these experiences of like, suicide is something that is it's a dark aspect of the human experience.
Yeah.
But I think
I can see how too it's like I have to take other people's lives. Why not mine?
mhm. Well, that was a really hard part of this for a long time. Like, as knowing, I'm like, I've taken so many lives. Could I take my own? And it was almost like this mental cat and mouse game between this part of me that's like, you could do it, and this other part of me is like, I bet you can't get me. This is really a really weird dynamic. But I mean, ultimately, like, I think I can't go back and change that, and I wouldn't, because I don't think the purpose of existence is to avoid the struggle.
Yeah.
I think to embrace it, going back to the Bhagavad Gita, like, I fucking love that book.
Yeah. What do
Like
you love about it?
I guess when I first read that, it resonated like at a very archetypal level with me, like to understand, just like on the floor of the chariot, and he's just like, he's in absolute like turmoil of like, he's called to fight, but yet he's fighting against his own family. And then really, that's what we're all doing.
Yeah.
So when you start
Kind
to
of like you with somebody you actually know,
yeah, literally, I never really thought about it that way, but yeah, like it is, we all know each other, like in a way, like even the most distant like human connection, like I believe like there is a very deep soul connection, to the well of the world. Like you can get very spiritual if you want to get like that. It's something that I believe in, like there is that connection. So you start realizing you don't freaking know everything, and all you got is like a little chunk of like the cosmos of understanding. And I think we're always trying to constantly figure out where our chunk fits in, where our truth and understanding fits in. And that was something that I experienced a lot in my time in Afghanistan. There's a lot of fascinating philosophical like aspects to some of like the culture there. We like to think of truth as like this monolithic thing that's like not subject to challenge. And the reality is like truth, there's a lot of variation as to how to interpret it. It's something that's very real. You can be looking at, we're looking at a house from one side, and you're like, the house is blue. I'm looking at the other side, I'm like, no, man, the house is red. Oh, your side might be painted blue, my side might be painted red. Who's right, who's wrong? Like, a lot of times we get focused into thinking what we see, what we observe, what we experience, while true is sometimes like it's only a piece of it. To sum it up, no, I changed nothing.
Yeah. You actually answered the other question within it too, I believe, which is like about how do you like separate yourself from the violence. And I feel like it kind of sounds like by understanding that this is part of your journey and your lessons and the other person's thing and the relationship between the two. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think again we have a lot here in the West. It comes from like a very good like place where we want to separate ourselves from the pain, from violence. But I think there is an important aspect, and I'm not saying like everybody has to embrace like violence, but I think understanding that like people are on different journeys sometimes, like again, connecting with the Bhagavad Gita, like it was like this archetypal story to me that when I heard and read it, I instantly recognized. I'm like, this is my journey in this story.
Yeah.
People might read it and be like, oh, interesting story, but like what they're here for at that moment in time, it may not be that. For me, it it was, as soon as I heard it, I was like, that's
Yeah,
it.
it's your life. Yeah. Like almost directly. But I want to talk to you about what's your meditation practice now, and then any tools or tips that you would recommend to people.
Yeah. So my meditation practice now, I mean, anybody who's experienced meditation, there's lots of variations sometimes from
Yeah.
day to day. I guess like one of my big things that I do is the box breathing. I mentioned it earlier. So like it's like a tool that I use like pretty often. For me, like the box breathing is kind of the short, easy way to bring like that focus out. Like when I have something that I'm trying to basically wrap my mind around, like I want to like work through something and focus like kind of that energy. Like for me, the box breathing, again, it connects the mind and body.
Can you tell people what box breathing is?
So the way that I kind of do it is basically we start kind of like breathing in. So breathing in for 4 seconds, and we hold for 4 seconds at the top of the breath. Then we're kind of releasing the breath 4 seconds, holding it at the bottom for 4 seconds. And we kind of repeat that process. I generally breathe through my nose, like for this. And typically what I find is it helps kind of just like zoom out and kind of give you like, okay, it makes sometimes in situations where I'm just like, man, how am I gonna deal with this, like this thought? How am I gonna get my head like around this? And for me, like it's kind of like it's just very grounding. It's fascinating because you actually start to see this 4x4 breathing technique pop up like in a lot of different practices. I think one of the funniest things I found in it is if anybody's grew up like Catholic, so Hail Mary, full of grace, that cycle is right around 4 seconds, and you start to see this pattern in all sorts of practices as well. And it's because there's like an actual physiological response that begins to occur like in this 4x4. And first time I ever learned this, it was from a British SAS student. I thought he was kind of like on the edge out there until I started doing it. And I was like, wow, this is a super quick way within, a period of, 40 seconds or so. Like you can really kind of just bring yourself back down and start making, decisions around things that sometimes are like, how do I do this? And you start feeling like that tension.
Yeah.
It's like a great way to kind of just bring it back down. So that's like when I want to focus like on outward. And then like the holotropic, like the Wim Hof style, like breathing is something that I find when I want to go in. Like I find that to be a really easy kind of practical way to like go about it. For people who aren't familiar with that sort of breathing, so it's a little bit different. It takes a little bit more intention, I think, like a little bit more focus. So you want a bit more space for it. But what we're doing kind of with that sort of breathing, you can get really super technical with it. And I highly recommend, like, if anybody's interested in this, like the Wim Hof style is probably one of the most like easily approachable like ways. Essentially, just to describe it for those who are listening, you're basically about 30 to 60 seconds of kind of breathing in. Usually it's like through the mouth. Basically, it's what we call like a circle breath. So like you're breathing in and there's no pause. So you breathe in and you're breathing out, just these full breaths in and out. And it kind of brings you to kind of almost like say like a hyperventilating kind of state where you're overloading like the system. So a lot of times you'll start, right around 30 to 60 seconds. And then at the end of that 60 seconds or so, you're going to hold the breath.
On empty.
Yeah, on empty. So
basically, just like we were talking about with shooting.
Yeah, you're going to come to that empty at that natural respiratory pause, and you're just going to hold it for as long as you can go until you start feeling, you're going to start feeling like the pressure build. And then
you start to freak out in your mind at first too, like I'm going to die.
You feel like you're going to die, and then there's a whole series of emotions that can kind of come up for it. And then once you can't hold it anymore, you breathe in, another about 15-second hold, and then you let out and you start the cycle again.
Yeah. Don't do this in the bathtub.
So yes, notes on this, guys. Make sure you're not driving a car or you're in a bathtub or anything like that, because this can become a very intense experience. Definitely more intentional. Like you definitely want to just be a very safe place for this. Like usually I'll do this maybe about 3 times, and it really helps in the space of those long holds. For me, there's a lot of stuff that's like going through my head, and it gives me like this space to kind of sort out, like in between breaths. I'm just sorting out like a lot of stuff and bringing a lot of focus back to the core of like what I want to experience. And so I typically will do this about 3 times. Like, so this also is I like to think of it as kind of like a gateway into like the holotropic breathing. So I've done longer sessions of this, guided with a practitioner up to about 45 minutes. And like, if you really want to experience the power of breath, it is a fascinating experience where you go to some incredible places within the mind and the heart of like the human experience just through this breathing practice. I've had experiences doing this where it is, for lack of better terms, it's a psychedelic experience where having these emotions and these thoughts and experiences that, like in a lot of things sometimes get kind of like trapped, in places, and it's a release to get at some of these things. So it's a huge spectrum, like the breathing. For me, like, again, meditative breathing, like as somebody who struggled a long time with how do I frickin' meditate, and just so much frickin' noise sometimes, like when you're first trying to like really get into that meditative space, it's frickin' hard. Like I've been there. And for me, the breath, like using the breath, either, the box breathing or, this like kind of Wim Hof style, like these are very accessible ways to kind of bring the mind and the body together. They're probably one of my favorite, most efficient ways for me to like kind of be like in this meditative space to kind of contemplate things. That's why I use breath a lot.
The meditation that you're going to be leading us in, if people want to stick around or come back another day or use it as often as you like in the next episode, what are you kind of thinking about leading us in?
So I think the box breathing, I think, again, it's so simple, and it's like my favorites. So I think that's a simple, easy way to go about that.
Okay. I look forward to it. And I just really, really, really want to thank you for taking all this time and for just like truly opening up. I'm sure a lot of people are going to like resonate with your vulnerability and all the stuff you shared. And I'm really grateful. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I know it's a pain sometimes trying to get a hold of me and like.
You're good. You're not the worst. Trust me, you're not the worst. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to your meditation.
Thanks.
Thank you guys for listening. We hope you stick around for the meditation on the next episode. If you're interested in wellness coaching through a meditative lens or starting your own meditation practice with accountability, check out themeditationward.com. Give us a follow on Instagram @themeditationward, and please like, review us, and share with your friends. See you soon.